Hi, and welcome to Assignment 15, Reviewing the ELD Standards. In this assignment, you'll have the opportunity to review the ELD standards for the grade level that's most relevant for you, and to also think about how those standards explicitly connect to your curriculum and instruction. So let's get started. The first thing that you want to do is download this note sheet. You can click on the link and bring up a Word document. When you bring up the Word document, you can either print it and handwrite directly into the copy, or you can type into it on your computer. If you're using a tablet device like an iPad, you won't be able to do either of those things. You will be able to view the document, however, so you might want to bring it up, take a look, and then recreate a similar document on a piece of paper so you can take some notes. Once you do that, we're going to visit the ELD Standards part of the website for the California Department of Education. So go ahead and click on this link in the Schoology Assignment 15 area and go here. When you go here, you'll see that you scroll down and all of the grade levels are listed. As we've stated before, go ahead and take a look at the grade level that most closely aligns with what you do on a daily basis. For the purpose of this assignment, we'll be looking at grade 6, since it's kind of in the middle of K to 12. In order to look at the grade level standards, just click on the link and it will bring up a PDF document. For the purpose of this video demo, we already have this document brought up. What you're going to do when you take a look at the document is to start making some observations about what you notice about the ELD standards. The first thing that you might notice is that the standards are no longer organized by the domains of ELA, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Instead, there are 3 parts. Part 1 is interacting in meaningful ways. These standards call for students to learn and use language while they're constructing understanding of the CCSS, the Common Core. So they do both simultaneously instead of learning language and then meeting the demands of Common Core. They depend on the authentic use of academic language for purposes like exploring ideas, arguing issues, and explaining processes. If you move down to Part 2, you'll notice that this is the second part of the standards, and it's learning about how English works. These standards focus on the features of academic language, like complex grammar and specific word choice, and how to use them to communicate and interpret messages. You might think of these standards as providing the language tools that are necessary to build academic discourse. Then, if we scroll all the way down to the end of the document, you might also notice that the third part is using foundational literacy skills. These standards provide the foundational literacy skills necessary for English learners who have not yet learned to read and write in English. These standards are printed separately in Appendix A and are organized by student age and level of literacy skills in the primary language. So one thing that you might want to do to further your learning is to take a look at Appendix A, which is linked on the page where all the grade level standards are on that website. So you might take a look at that at some other time, like I said, to extend your learning. So let's go back and look at some other things that we notice. Once we know the structure of the standards, something else that we can notice is that you can see here that the ELD standards are aligned to specific Common Core state standards, and they are the grade level standards. So you can see speaking and listening 6.1 and 6, listening 6.3 and 6, or I'm sorry, language 6.3 and 6, writing, and you can kind of see the code that this particular document uses. There are also 3 levels of proficiency, whereas before there were 5. So we've got, in terms of the 3 levels of proficiency, we have emerging, expanding, and bridging. The ELD standards now simultaneously allow students to build language and meet the skills of the Common Core, which is something that's kind of a unique feature about them. Whereas before they were very much focused on students' building of language and not necessarily smoothly intertwined with the California standards. So that's something else that you'll notice. So you can see those observations are recorded here on column 1 of my 3-column note chart. You can also go through the standards and make other observations and list whatever comes to mind and whatever you notice. Once you go through the standards and take a look at them and really think about what this means for your students and also your work as a professional, we'd like to ask you to think about the specific language considerations that these standards might have. For example, if we're looking at interacting in meaningful ways, you can see that there's a lot of language here about argument, negotiating to persuade others, There's a lot of collaboration, conversational exchanges, contributing to class and group and partner discussions. So there's a lot here about that. If I'm thinking about the specific language considerations that my students would need in order to be successful, one thing that I'm thinking about is that emerging students are going to need vocabulary. They're going to need words that help them talk about friendly and familiar topics, because that's called out in the standards here. They're also going to need to understand typical WH questions and how to respond to them, which is also called out in the standards here. So you can see students have to be able to engage in those kinds of conversations and respond to WH questions. They're also going to need to understand simple sentence and phrase structure in English in order to respond in ways that make sense. So if students are going to respond in English, they have to know how to form sentences that make sense for their listener. For expanding students, students are kind of in this middle ground in terms of negotiating or persuading others and using phrases like "I agree with X" and that sort of thing. Students are really going to need to know vocabulary that is relevant to the language of argument. They're going to need to know what agree means and disagree and however and some of those transition words as well. They're also going to need maybe phrase and sentence structures that allow students to express agreements or disagreements. They might need specific sentence stems or specific supports that help build some of that academic language as well. For example, "I agree, but," "while I see your point." So building in some of those language supports specifically for students who are acquiring English might be something that's really important. So as you think about the language demands that students are going to need as they meet these ELD standards, we're just asking you to record your thoughts in this middle column on this note sheet. Finally, we need to think about how this is going to impact our instruction. So I'm thinking, first of all, if there is an expectation that English learners are learning how to communicate with each other and engage in discussion, as a teacher, I have to incorporate many ways for ELs to interact with other students in the class. They need to be in situations constantly that ask them to use their language, use their English that they're acquiring. If we're going to ask students to respond to familiar topics, we need to think about some of the best topics and prompts that would be familiar to students. If we're asking students to talk about things that they wouldn't really have any understanding or cultural knowledge of, then that might be difficult for students to actually engage in conversation. So as a teacher of English learners, I also have to think about what I'm going to actually ask my students so that they can participate in conversation. Certainly in the lines of argument and discussion, there are particular cultural norms in the United States that students may not be aware of. So I might actually need to do some explicit teaching around how to ask for clarification in the United States, how to engage in argument. And along that same line, I might need to teach students norms for conversation. For example, how to provide eye contact, because in some cultures that's not part of what they do in norms of conversations. So those are just a few instructional considerations that I might have in my classroom. So we're asking you to think about maybe some others that you're thinking about for your particular teaching context. Once you have an opportunity to complete the 3 columns of the note sheet and really think through the ELD standards and what they mean for you as a professional, and also your students, we're going to ask you to go back to the Schoology Assignment 15, and you can click the Next button here, which will take you to our discussion forum. You'll notice in the discussion forum there are 3 discussion questions. You can respond to those discussion questions electronically in this box and engage in conversations with your colleagues from across the district, or if you're doing this in a learning team or as part of your site professional development, you can also have these conversations in person. Whatever supports your learning the most is what we're asking you to do. Thank you so much for reviewing the ELD standards. We hope that you're learning how these can apply to your teaching context, your classroom, and your school.